Most AI initiatives are not failing yet because of the technology, even though the technology is very early. They're failing because of the people. For every senior executive or CEO that may be listening, it has to start with you. This is not about delegating it to a team. This is about your personal journey of learning where the future is headed. Whether you make a big deal of it or not, they're in their, they're in the now virtual hallways of most companies, but sometimes real hallways, talking about, will AI replace me? Will AI replace us? Will our business exist? I have a company that's making sure they're, surviving.
Good morning, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, James. Thanks for having me.
Jason, there was an article that you published recently that caught my eye, and it's something that is a conversation that we're having both internally at Microsoft and also that we're having with customers. And the conversation really is around not delegating AI yourself so that you're then better able to work with it at the enterprise level and work with it internally with your peers, et cetera. And you focus on a very unique audience. So tell us a little bit about your role at Spencer Stewart, who you work with primarily, and how you have these conversations, your clients, around becoming a power user of AI so that you can then become an advocate and an evangelist for AI inside the organization.
James, thanks again for having me. We at Spencer Stewart deal with C-suite executives and board members, and I specifically deal with CEOs and board members. And that ranges from pre-revenue, high-growth startups all the way to Fortune 10 companies. And we spend a lot of time talking to them about what is going on in their jobs, what is going on with their leadership approach. And whenever there's a topic as large and transformative as AI, it tends to dominate the CEO talk track and agendas, and increasingly will dominate the board agendas for what they want the CEO to spend their time on. And when we're called in to help either find a new CEO, help a CEO with their succession plan, or help a CEO who's maybe having some trouble with their approach to their leadership style, and they want us to work with their top team or their board on helping them be more effective. One of the questions that always comes up is, what's your strategy? What are you trying to do? What's the what of the job? And in doing that, again, things like AI tend to be front and center.
And when you talk with board members, prospective board members, CEOs, prospective CEOs, how are they initially thinking about AI and using it personally? And then how do you expand that conversation with them?
Yeah. So there's a bit of a disconnect right now. And I find that um, it depends, first of all, what kind of company they're in. So that ranges from somebody who's actually running a company that's building AI first tools all the way to a company that might be making heavy industrial equipment. And one of the things we start with is, given what kind of business you're in, what kind of business strategy you have, where should you be on the AI adoption curve? And then for you personally, what does that mean? And the reason I say there's a bit of a gap is that everyone's talking a lot about AI, but when we ask people what they're doing with AI, a vast majority of senior executives are really using AI predominantly like a search engine. And they're really excited about the quality of results it produces as a search engine that both finds and can synthesize results, whether that's mathematical results, data results, or sort of language-based information. But they're not yet taking it to the next level of a useful tool um, consistently enough. And so what we saw was this, or see continuously, is this gap between how people are doing work at kind of AI native companies or in AI native roles versus how senior executives. And, the best example I can use is, um, as we saw PCs become commonplace throughout the 80s and 90s, you saw some executives that still were using Steno Pads and had secretarial tools and were saying, somebody should use a computer, but not me. And then you had some companies, that would say you have to write your own database queries. And so that disconnect, meant that some executives were using the tools to be way more productive than others.
I read an article recently where there was a study that was done, and the results of that study was if you ask a high school level question to an AI, it will give you a high school level answer. But if you ask it a PhD level question, right, and you put a little more thought into it and a little bit more of your context, your business problem, what you're looking for, right? So if you ask a more uh, in-depth question, it will give you a more in-depth answer. So the value of the results from the AI is correlated with the level of the query, the level of the question, the level of the inquiry that's being made.
Yeah, and we see this, part of the reason in the article we wrote, we put in specific prompts, and we had a lot of debate because some of us wanted to write, massive, complex, incredibly detailed prompts, and then our fabulous editorial team was like, "You're losing the reader, guys. This is like half a page prompt." I said, "Well, but that's actually what we, And I was using one for photo editing where it was incredibly specific. It was like, here's the f-stop you should use, and here's what kind of background, and here's the actual product of the lens, and they're like, yeah, this is beyond most readers. So we balanced, kind of the art. And part of that goes from, okay, how do you go from just prompting to actually automating to thinking about how you're going about your workday? And I think what people are starting to realize is that it's not just using one AI tool. It may be using 12 different tools throughout your day that are specialized for different parts of your workflow. And to think about, what can you do differently? And, I think people do hit bumps. One, this technology is changing very quickly. And so recognizing that something it couldn't do 6 months ago, it's totally okay. Try it again. And the other is just recognizing that, to your point, there is a little bit of, if you give it a bad prompt, it'll give you a bad, result. Um, Somebody was debating with me how useful it was because it makes mistakes. I said, you do have employees, right? And he sort of paused. He goes, yeah, okay, that's fair. Because, if you get a bunch of employees who aren't used to doing something, and the first time you give them instructions, they usually don't do it everything perfectly. That's okay. You teach them, you mentor them, you apprentice them. And that same sort of mindset has to be approached with AI. The other thing that I like to bring up is that if we go back to the famous, internet companies of the mid 90s, if you use the Wayback Machine and you look at where they were in 97, 98, 99, the first couple of years of the web, they were incredibly rudimentary. I won't name a specific company, but pick your favorite one, whether it's still around or not, and go back to look at what it looked like, because we forget, because that was 20 plus years ago. And when you go back and look, you're like, oh my God, that was so rudimentary. It was text links. It had notes most of these sites had notes everywhere that you could email someone, to do the process manually, because we were all used to a catalog, phone-based world. And so, if we think about where we are in the, AI learning, sort of evolution of technology relative to what we saw with web-based technology in the 90s, we're like in the first inning, and the rate of pace, the rate of change is even faster than it was then.
Yeah, the comment you made about employees, one parallel that I've heard is in many ways it's a chief of staff. So if you have a new chief of staff that's new to your company, doesn't have all the context, um, they will, and then a year later they have more context about the company and how it operates. The quality of the responses, the quality of the support is going to increase based on the time that you spend training it, educating it.
Yeah, people expect this kind of de novo magic, and they don't realize that, people who are using AI um, deeply are training agents. They're building agents. They're populating information so that it's better at the task at hand. It is more context and it has more familiarity. Um, and they're mixing and matching different tools to do that as well.
Yeah. So Jason, let's walk through your 3-step process that you laid out and how you have these conversations with your clients. So your first recommendation is, let's build a sandbox, personal sandbox. Let's create a place to start with AI.
Yeah, and again, the idea here is this is for a novice. If you feel like you are already, further along, you can jump ahead. And we tried to give things that are easy. So we said start with 4 tasks. One is evaluate your communications. So, this is something that every senior executive, every CEO needs to do is communicate. They're sending out emails, they're sending out um, uh, they may be doing an all hands. And so one of the things is you can review communications from different stakeholder point of views. You can say, imagine you're a brand new employee in this part of the business with this mindset and background. What would you take away from the email that this CEO just sent out?
Mm.
Right. That's something that's very hard to get honest feedback on, all the way to you're now a board member getting the same email. What would you think? So that's an example on communications. The second is really auditing your time allocation and personal effectiveness. This is something that we highly encourage executives to do anyhow, but the act of manually printing out your calendar and highlighting and analyzing what's what is quite hard. But what you can do is download a file of your calendar. You might need to redact some data if you've got very sensitive information in there. We would recommend, um, even if you're using enterprise AI, I think that being thoughtful about what you're uploading is critical. But then saying, all right, I'm trying to accomplish these main things or spend time with these main stakeholders. How did I do over the last month doing that? And what's great is that there's no political retelling of history here. It's going to be brutally honest and say, hey, James, you failed. Your goal was to spend time with these major partners, and it turns out you only spent 20% of your time with them, and you spent 60, 70% of your time in internal meetings that really weren't very effective anyhow. Well, if you're a CEO, that's pretty helpful. The third is to learn something and to stay current. And so, it's one of the great uses of AI is to learn. And so using it as a learning tool can be a very effective way to jump into the sandbox. And then the final task is something that's a little bit more advanced. We say automate a task, pick something where you can automate something that you do every day. Um, and this could be something like, be a strategic advisor based on the news, the current events and the changing competitive landscape. It could be something about competitors, but something that you're going to then automate as a regular occurrence is that last step of building a sandbox. And again, the idea here is to jump in and try easy things that can be personally effective. And if you do that personally or professionally, that's okay, right? You can do all of these same things personally. You can say, um, I'm going to send a note to my kids. Let me know what you think about it. Again, I'm not saying let it parent. I'm just saying, try it out in a way that's safe and easy and gives you some feedback.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that first recommendation is most, the first step, the baby step, right, today with generative AI and agents is help me write something better. But what you've actually recommended is have the AI evaluate what you're writing for tone and for receptivity according to different audiences. That's actually something that I've not heard or thought of before, but it's a really interesting way to get an understanding of how people, audiences, groups might perceive the messages that you're trying to land.
Really interesting example of this is we were working with a board, um, and the CEO was struggling a bit to sort of predict how the board meeting was going to go. And we said, how are you using AI? And he kind of looked at us like we were crazy. What does this have to do with AI? And we said, well, we've seen this in a number of senior team meetings, boards, where a CEO will actually set up agents for each board member and feed it some meeting minutes, some, historical information about that person, who they are, their social media, and then set up the whole board. and actually give the document, the pre-read memo, the document to the virtual board and say, what key questions do you have? And we were talking to one CEO about this, and his eyes lit up, and he's like, "Oh my God, that's fabulous!" And he did it, and he called me back. I don't know, 2, 3 months later, and he said, "You wouldn't believe it. I created this, sort of digital twin of my board. I sent it the materials. I made a few changes. I then sent it back and said, what key questions?" And so when I then recorded or transcribed the key questions to the board meeting, it was like 90% accurate, asking the questions that those board members were going to ask. Because it turns out, Joe always asks the same 3 questions. Mary always asks the one sort of orthogonal thing that is one step removed, but super interesting. And, the AI kind of nailed it. And so, that can be a fun way to understand the perspectives of people. And even if it doesn't get it perfectly right, it helps you think about, how people from different backgrounds are going to react to material you're putting out there.
Yeah. So in many ways, it's akin to old school red teaming and wargaming,
Yeah.
right? Who's going to do what? If I do this, walk me through the scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. It's again, it's really, I think your point is a lot of people are using it to write. And what's more interesting is to know, is the writing I'm doing actually conveying what I want to the audience I want it to convey to? And then you can use it to tune to say, well, what recommendations, what would strengthen it? Um, I will admit I sometimes use it just for humor, and I'll say, I'll pick my favorite dead comic, and I'll say, please rewrite this memo to the team, with Robin Williams or whomever. And it's pretty, like when you're having a bad day, that can also
Yeah.
just bring a little levity.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Um, so your second step is go deeper on AI. What does that look like with C-level executives and board members?
Yeah, and this is the part where we think a lot of people stop, right? So even if they get that sandbox, they're like, "Yep, I get AI now. I can like prompt like a maniac. I'm there." And what we say is that what we're seeing is this real divide of work, how people get work done, how people incorporate it as really a always their tool, as opposed to like something they're using very modestly. Um, and so one of the things that we recommend is find a mentor. And really, that's find somebody who is really, really using AI for their job so that you can see what does this look like in the extreme. Now, a great example is somebody who's doing um, coding with AI, because you'll watch so much of their job move towards, code assisted or, AI assisted coding, but it really transforms how they work. I mean, I'm sure you've seen engineers who, used to sit there and write code, compile, and now they've got, a million different agents writing different pieces of code, and they're like the orchestra leader, right? They're not actually writing any code. They're orchestrating different pieces getting put together, um, all the way down to, people using, AI tools to prototype or rapidly prototype designs before they're even coding, because they want to see where they're going with it. Um, and we see that in a lot of different startups. We see this in some areas of academia. And I would say go as native as you can, go as, transformative as you can in terms of somebody is personal use of AI in their job. So you can see how different that looks than your typical executive who spends, 80% of their time in very structured meetings, in very formal settings. I recently was talking to an executive, and he was saying, well, the number one thing at our company is to be on time. I was like, I'm not sure that's a strategic advantage. I think that's a really interesting cultural norm. And like, I get it. You want to be respectful of people's time. But I can see this company where they're like kind of okay with 2 minutes late, but each executive has, a totally transformative approach to AI, and they're getting a lot of work done. Yeah, they can be on time too, but it's just, where does that stack in the order of operations? So the first thing is finding a mentor. I think, the second thing is, really build some AI fundamentals. And what we mean by that is, really the learning curve, go a little bit deeper in learning. What are these tools? How do they work? Even if you have the curiosity down to, well, how did the fundamental models work? And the reason we think this is important is that it helps you understand where it might go. Because again, it's moving so quickly that you don't want to just say, well, I learned how to use this tool and that's it. That's what it'll do. Because as a leader, what you have to also think about is, where is this going? Where is it headed? What can it do next? Whether you're running a software company or a manufacturing company or a sales company, or whatever it is, you want to start to go, well, where might this be in 5 years? Where might this technology evolve to, so that you're thinking about it? And the 7 core areas are just machine learning fundamentals. What is machine learning? Some basics about model architecture. How do they work? What is a transformer? What is a neural network? A little bit around arithmetic problem solving. Some basic data engineering basics, because people will sit there and say, I've got so much data. Data is my moat. And I'm like, well, do you understand data engineering? Do you understand what data is useful and in what structure? And are you capturing something that's actually useful? Something around valuation and metrics, something around deploying and scaling, and then something around responsible AI use and governance. And we purposely put responsible AI use and governance last, because if you don't understand what AI can do, there's no point in rushing to put a governance system in place. In fact, we just had a conversation with the CEO who is standing up a new AI task force. And we asked him, what are your goals? And really high on the list was AI governance. And we said, listen, no offense, but if you put the lawyers in the room first to talk about governance, you're probably not going to get to a good end state view of what this can do, because you'll spend all the time talking about what it shouldn't do. Now, it's great. You should have governance. You should talk about the ethical implications, the IP implications, all the things you need to think about as a senior leader. But first, you have to envision where it's going. It's kind of like saying, let's make sure we have fire sprinklers in the house we're not going to design. Well, where do they go? I don't know. I haven't written the design because I'm really worried it might burn down. The more you focus on that element, and again, we're highly recommending you do it, you've got to do it at the right stage, because as a leader, you have to understand where this is going.
The other element, or the one element that caught my attention, was data, because
Yeah.
one of the things that we're seeing is people jump to the AI first, right? And they'll do a small co-pilot, they'll do an agent, and it'll perform a very specific task. But when you want to expand it and start managing an end-to-end business process, the data might not be ready for that. And generally it's not, right? So how do you manage that conversation around making sure that the fundamentals are there, and helping them understand the importance of going deeper in that space?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, people have been on these data paths for quite a few years now. The emergence of data lakes. I will admit I call them data swamps. And the reason is that I think people tend to just throw the kitchen sink in. All the data in the enterprise, we just throw in the swamp. And they don't tend to come out of the swamp. It tends to be like quicksand, where you're like, well, I'm still building the data lake. I've talked to CEOs who are like, yeah, I've been building the data lake for a decade. We're making it better. We're putting all the data in, more data. And I think the point with AI is, what is the data? It actually gives you a critical lens to what data is differentiated and useful for the task at hand. And how much data is critical, right? It may turn out that what you need is just enough training data to differentiate what you're going to do with AI versus a competitor, but you don't need exhaustive data. You just need enough data, or you might need data from a certain high-performing element of your business, not all of your business. And so being really thoughtful about what are you trying to do with AI, and therefore what data might you need, and do you have it or not, and do you need to use exhaustive data or portions of data, become really helpful. And sometimes this is non-obvious. I mean, I am, one of the famous early examples of, what humans versus machines can do, is a problem, the chicken sexing problem. And it turns out that, there used to be this very high paid job in the US called chicken sexers. They would go to farms and figure out, which gender all the chicks were. And then all the chicken sexers got drafted for the war, and they needed to figure out how to do this. And it turns out they could put another person next to the chicken sexer and watch them doing it. And just by watching the repetition, the other humans could go, oh, okay, I get the pattern. They couldn't explain it, but they could understand it and replicate it. And, I always use this example because I'm like, a neural net or a model may be doing something very similar, but you may not need every piece of data ever known to mankind. You may just need to sit it next to the chicken sexer for a few hours. And so again, understanding what you need with the data can be really helpful. To do that, though, you need to know where you might go, right? Because if you say, well, we're only going to use it for customer service, so it's really important we get all our customer service data, that's great. But you might find that actually where you really want to use it is marketing or product or, um, uh, fundamentally how you um, interact with customers to understand where you should be going from your roadmap. Those aren't going to be answered if you're just collecting very narrow sets of data.
Mm. And if you've been experimenting across different use cases, different tools as an executive, you naturally get that understanding of what data contributes to good results, which data does not, and the challenge in accessing the data, because maybe it's in a folder that is marked confidential, and that critical data is not coming back in the results that you're looking for.
Right. And again, this is at different levels. It's what's the data individually that you might want to, assemble just for your agent or your AI use, all the way to enterprise-wide data strategies where as a CEO, you're not just thinking about my prompting or my agent use or my tool use. You're actually thinking about, do I have data that's going to actually allow me to do things that other companies can't do? And what might those things be? And I think that really understanding the value of the data is critical, because the other thing you might find is that, boy, um, that data can be replicated now with automated agents in a way that you don't see coming. And in some ways might actually be replicated cleaner than the data you've got, because your data might be in 17 different systems on 3 different continents, with poor, metadata attached to it. And what you really need is something fresh and clean that you can use automation to help you assemble. But I think people sort of knee jerk that they either need to assemble all the data or they need to proclaim that they have great data and it's going to be super competitive and valuable. And I think a lot of CEOs don't step back to say, well, what actually is valuable in this data and what isn't, I mean, Reddit's such a good example of, it's sort of complicated, unstructured data, but in the early days of all of these models training, it turns out Reddit becomes such an important source of just human knowledge and interaction and data. Obviously, the Reddit about what color should I paint my fence might not have been super helpful, but it really did expose that this organization that was sort of not going into the community space as a data asset suddenly became a really valuable data asset. And again, so part of that's thinking about, well, what are the fumes of your business that you may not even be thinking about that are actually quite powerful?
Hmm. So the third phase for your clients is building that vision, right? So you've become familiar. You've gone a little bit deeper. How do you coach uh, clients into this next phase?
Yeah. So I would say at each of these phases, there's a lot of fall off and breaking. And at the core, we're a leadership firm. We're all about, advising leaders to be better. Um, we're not a technical firm. We're not a consulting firm. We're really a leadership advisory firm, whether that's helping you find a new leader or helping a leader get better. And so when it gets to the AI vision, this third phase, it's where our superpower kicks in, because we're really helping leaders think about, first of all, what is your vision, right? Are you setting a tone that 50% of your employees will be their work product will be done by agents? Are you setting a tone where your business model itself will be transformed? Or are you setting a vision where it's like 5% of our customer service interactions might be done by a bot, right? Like, how ambitious and for who, right? Is that for your investors? Is that for your employees? It turns out that on a side note here, it, employees are already talking about this. right? Whether you make a big deal of it or not, they're in their, they're in the now virtual hallways of most companies, but sometimes real hallways, talking about, will AI replace me? Will AI replace us? Will our business exist? And even businesses that feel very removed from AI, they're still talking about it, right? They're talking about, am I at a company that's progressive and using the latest and greatest tools? Am I at a company that's making sure they're, surviving? So the first thing is like really dig into that vision and what you're trying to convey with it in terms of where you're going and on the right horizon. So that's the first step. The second really begins to think about change management. And what we see is that most AI initiatives are not failing yet because of the technology, even though the technology is very early, they're failing because of the people. And so the two pieces we talk about in the article, the first is the learning plan. So this really is about leveling up your organization. It's a lot of the things that we are suggesting for CEOs, the sandbox and the experimentation. We're saying, how do you do that with your whole team? And, very simple things that you do as a leader. So for example, in every team meeting, do you have a seat at the table for an AI agent? Do you incorporate it, and how do you talk to your team about how you're using it to work? Are you then fostering, the right learning tools for all of them to be curious? And I would say that this is, there's some skeptics who say, oh yeah, all the AI spending is just people throwing, education and pilots at everybody. But the reality is, if your employees don't learn how to type, it's not really helpful to give them a computer in 1988, right? You couldn't, your ability to get something out of it was highly limited by your ability to type. Now you're highly limited by your ability to understand the potential of what these tools can do and use them effectively. So it's kind of like sending everybody to typing class, or sending everyone to, basic training. So we've got to get the learning plan. And then the other one is really to look at the culture. How are you building a culture of experimentation? And this is really important because what we're not saying is throw a bunch of random pilots at the wall. What we're saying is, are there specific things that can be done that will experiment towards the vision you have, and not to just look at it as a project from the IT team, but to really think about the culture change and the culture discussion you're going to have with the organization about change. Because where most of these things run into problems is the humans. And people are scared, they're uncomfortable, these are new tools, and they might just fight it enough that you can't get, whether you've got the right idea or not, you've got to build this notion of learning is important, trying to move towards your vision is important. And how do you not have a penalty for somebody trying to learn? A great example is, we were talking to a CEO the other day and he said, I rolled out some training and we did this. Then we realized nobody was using anything, even though we were pretty sure we had a great use case identified. And I said, well, was it clear they were allowed to? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, you have a very rigid culture. If I said to my boss in your culture that I need 2 hours a day for 10 days to learn this new stuff and experiment and maybe produce some work product that wasn't so good, how would that go? And he paused and he said, yeah, that wouldn't go well. Like, your boss would tighten the screws and tell you to, get it together. And the challenge is, whenever we try to do something a new way, whether it's driving to work a different way or, trying out a different, a different cooking approach, every time you try something new, it probably doesn't go as well as the old way you do it. And it usually doesn't, it takes longer holistically because there's learning involved, right? If I say, you're a product manager and you've been doing product work your whole life, now I want you to use a rapid prototyping tool with AI to do some prototyping. You will not be as effective the first go round. You're still opening up the package, right? So to speak. And so as a culture and as a leader, you've got to think about, are you making that okay? And not forever, right? Because the goal is ultimately to make these tools a better part of your workplace, but are you allowing people to go through that journey of learning without penalty? And that's where we see a lot of these things right now failing is that people set these big ambitions, spend a bunch of money, roll out a bunch of tools, and then say, but you're not allowed to spend any time learning how to use them well, or you can't, don't screw up any work product because, that will be frowned upon. And, you need a little trial and error to make something work. I don't know about you. My first prompt didn't go so well. I had to do it a few times.
Well, and the the other aspect of this is that there is shadow AI, right? To your point, people are doing this a little bit on the side, right? So one of the things you want to do is bring it out of the shadows, right? Bring it into your organization, and then feed some fertilizer, grow it a little bit, but give it some guidance, rather than letting it run amok in your organization.
Yeah. And one of the things we're seeing is that the larger the company, even tech companies, and I could ask you, but I won't embarrass you. Their employees are much more limited in what they're allowed to use. And I'm not gonna point at any CIOs or CISOs, but I think that the immediate response to AI from most large companies was to lock it down, put a governance program in place, pick at most one tool that people can use, put a lot of boundaries around the use cases, and say, we're really ahead of the curve on AI. And then when you go to an AI native company or a company that's, really pushing the boundaries, they're doing things like every employee has a budget for tokens. And we've seen employees that are using 1 trillion tokens a tokens a year, right? $250,000 worth of tokens, depending on the price and the quality.
Yeah.
But, this is not your, your lockdown, enterprise IT strategy. These are companies that are saying every coder has a budget. You pick the best tools, and every week we will compare which tools are winning, right? These are companies that are saying, we want you to push the boundaries of productivity, try to do it, try to break, try to, see what you can do. And so, there is this push and pull between the large companies and the small companies. We saw this with the internet as well. We saw this with mobile. Every big technology wave, small companies just don't have as much risk. And so it's easier for them to learn, to experiment, to try things because they don't have anxiety about what all the negative things that could happen. And that's a very logical response. But to your point, I mean, I was talking to an investor the other day at a really blue chip company, and he said, "Oh yeah, I bought a personal laptop for my work desk so that I can use AI for all my, personal things. And then I have my work computer that I'm using for my kind of work things because I can't use any AI tools. I've got, he mentioned one. He said, I've got that one, but actually it turns out it's not really well suited for what I do. So, it's an okay generic enterprise tool, but it's not useful for me. So I have, and he took me through it. He had like 48 different kinds of AI tools on his personal computer, and he was a power user, but not at work. And part of that, to your point, is getting that stealth out of the shadows so that your organization can say, all right, who are the power users and what are you doing? And what would you do if we let you at work and let a little bit of that out so that you can learn from those people as opposed to, cauterizing them, which is, I think, what's happening today, enterprise IT risk can, unfortunately, stop people from wanting to learn. And again, you have to think about the balance of what is the real risk, right, as an enterprise, and what is the signal you're sending to particularly a very progressive employee who wants to be learning the latest and greatest. And, you're saying blocked, blocked, blocked. At some point, they're going to find a company that's saying, learn, learn, learn. And, that's a very big difference. I mean, I was stunned. I was talking to one of the hot AI companies, and they were encouraging their employees to use all the tools they didn't build. They're like, yeah, please use tool X and Y and Z and D because we want you experimenting with, the latest and greatest, even if we didn't build it. And, that isn't the approach of most, even large tech companies. Usually you can dog food our tools, don't dog food our competitors' tools. And they were like, no, please, push the envelope.
Awesome. Awesome. So, Jason, any last thoughts? Any, folks that are looking at how to do this and might be a little hesitant, Any last thoughts for those folks on how to get started?
I- I'll leave with two. One we talked about, which is the mentorship. Find a mentor, find a buddy, find a, it could be a high schooler, doesn't matter, but find a buddy. And then the second is for every senior executive or CEO that may be listening, it has to start with you. This is not about delegating it to a team. This is about your personal journey of learning where the future is headed. You're not going to hold out and dictate your emails. This is about you getting on the keyboard. And the faster you learn, the faster you get there, the more inspired you will be as a leader about the reality of the future that's coming at us. Um, and people will be excited to follow you if you are excited about the future and you're digging in.
And the one thing I found is it's easier to take that first step if you have a community of mentors or peers around you that are also doing that. It's a little easier to experiment. It's a little easier to fail, right? If you can share failures and someone else says, "Yeah, that happened to me also," and you learn from each other and you uh, get each other excited about doing the next best thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, I mean, that is very true about any kind of learning, but I think having a good culture of, learners around you helps you embrace it and realize that you're not alone. These are not, we wrote this article largely because every single CEO we were talking to was asking about how do I approach this? And as I said, we're not an AI consultancy, we're a leadership consultancy, but this is a new leadership tool. This is a new leadership area. It's like, if every leader said, I heard this thing called corporate finance. Do I need to know anything about it? We'd be like, yeah, that's pretty important. This is a new functional area for companies, the same way that, they had to be fluent in technology broadly to be an enterprise leader. This is now something you need to be a lot more fluent in because it's going to matter. It's like if you were a retail company in 1995 going, yeah, the internet's just a catalog, that probably didn't work out real well for you. And so now we're saying get ahead of it, learn, see where it's going, because it will be a big part of your future. It's not a part of your future. The impact of this technology on your labor market or your competitive set or your customer base may change how you do business. And so a lot of companies that say, oh, well, we're further away. We're going to wait till the robots come because, nobody is doing what we do using AI. You may step back and go, actually, you may be very affected by AI, just not in the ways you're imagining. It may be that your customer base is changing how they want to interact. Again, how many people, if you don't have if you didn't have a website in 2002, people would look at your company like it wasn't real. If you can't buy something online or transact online or schedule a meeting online, people are now like, well, they don't want to interact, right? They don't want to, I mean, this is why there's certain sectors of our economy, whereas consumers, we go, I want the doctor I can schedule online, not the doctor I have to call in during during work hours to schedule. This is going to be the kinds of things that are subtle but important in how companies adopt technology going forward. Is are you allowing, it's a crazy example. Are you allowing my agent to interact with you? Are you allowing your agent to interact with me? How are you thinking about that? So again, I think just getting ahead of it as a leader is critical, and it starts with learning. So I appreciate that, James, of, get a peer group, get a community.
Excellent. Jason, awesome conversation. Thank you so much.